came up to him and said, "Oh, we're terribly sorry, but the car you parked out front has been towed away." It was in a no parking zone or something like that. And their digestive enzymes went down to 0. Because as soon as emotions come into play, the body will then send its energy to the adrenals, to the pituitary, to the areas of nerve supply, away from the process of digestion. So the body will then conserve its energy and send it to emotions and won't send it to digestion. The two are not compatible with each other. So if we approach food and we're anxious or angry or disturbed in any way, the digestive process will not occur as beautifully as it and completely as it should. And that's why it's a frustrating practice around the ashram, but we try to eat in silence. Because even if you're talking about the weather when you're eating, especially on these hot days, it can create some emotional feelings. And these will interfere with the digestive process. So separating eating as a separate activity, it's very difficult in our culture, because what do we do when we celebrate? We go out and eat. When we're depressed, we go and eat. What are we going to do tonight? Well, let's go out and eat. And so social and eating are so close together in our society. But you won't see it in India. In India, they have a neat way of avoiding this. They line everybody up against the wall and feed you one by one, and you're not facing anybody. So if you want to talk to somebody, you have to turn to the side, because your food's in front of you and there's nothing else. You're in lines, but nobody faces each other. Pretty much they'll line you up against a wall, and everybody will be lined up around the wall of a room like this, but you won't be facing someone across the table. And someone will come and serve you from the other side of your banana leaf, and you won't have anyone to talk to while you're eating, so you just eat. So you see, in a relatively uncultured, what we think as uncivilized or uncultured country, they actually have many practices developed from years of culture and civilization that we could benefit by using. And that is separating our actions, doing one thing at a time. So it's a difficult thing. What we can begin to do is simply to, maybe when we go out to eat, maybe taking things that are easy to digest, or taking a moment in the midst of eating to reflect on how we're doing the eating. It often happens when you're out to eat and talking at the same time that you look down and you realize, oh, it's half eaten, and you weren't even aware of what you ate or what we ate. So Swamiji once mentioned that if you eat and talk at the same time, you might as well eat through your nose, because you're bypassing the whole process of entering into the system. There's an interesting book to read about food that I would recommend, called The Psychologist's Eat Anything Diet. And I don't always agree with their diet recommendations, but the points they bring up about psychology and eating are important. And one of them is they describe the difference between foods which beckon and foods which hum. And the foods which beckon are the ones when you're sitting in a restaurant and you look down the menu and say, "Oh boy, cheesecake." Or you're walking down the street and you look in the window and say, "Oh boy, look at that." Anything that says "oh boy" is beckoning. The foods which hum are the things like salad, tofu. Just sort of humming in the system. You don't get that excited. I suppose you can get excited about it after a while. But it's not beckoning you to eat. And one practice they recommend is to sit for a period of time before eating, close your eyes and think, what does the body want? What does the body need? And this frees us up from being caught up in the whole process. Another interesting book is called Fat is a Feminist Issue, which is fascinating and brings up a lot of points about the psychology of eating. and body image, and how these different things relate. And quite a useful book that you might recommend to any of your students who are overweight is called One Bowl. And it's just a little book, but very much easy to read, and has some hints about approaches to food. It's all of it aimed toward higher consciousness, because really what we have, and Gurudev's described it very beautifully, is we have a set of customs officers for this country here. And we have eyes to look at the food and say, it looks like it's okay to come into this country. And the food comes a little closer toward Manhattan. And it's off the coast. And you can smell it and you say, smells like it's okay. A little closer to the tongue, final customs inspector. Yeah, it's okay. And then finally pass. But unfortunately, we don't have to go to Watergate or any place else for a corrupt government, because the tongue and the nose and the eyes are all caught up in the process of processing all this into the country, and the chief customs officer is taking things and putting them in his own satchel. So the tongue is eating for itself rather than for any of the rest of the body. That's why it's better to train these people who've gone crazy, these wild horses up here, by looking down to the stomach and saying, hey, did you finish what I gave you last? Where is it? Yesterday's food. Still there? Are you really ready for it? Anything else? What do you need? And just experiencing that consciousness that it takes to slow down and find out what the body needs. Well, so digestion beginning in the mind and then coming to the senses, we come to the mouth. And there's a proverb in naturopathy, Nature Cure, that says all disease begins in the mouth. And it's really true that so much of disease is related to diet, nutrition. And of course that's related to emotions, which is related to exercise. And so you get into a whole cycle. But in South India they have a saying, one of their traditional sayings is that you'll never have need of a doctor or any medicines if you just take care never to eat until you finish digesting what you ate before. In fact, they had a school of nature cure called Fletcherism, which taught people to chew 70 or 80 times with each bite. And not only did it fix and give them good gum stimulation, but you couldn't eat a whole lot of food when you chew 80 chews to every bite. So it certainly protected the digestive tract from getting overburdened, which is, of course, such a root cause of disease in our country. Allergies, arthritis, all those things are related to digestive tract. So to be reasonable, about 30 to 50 chews for every bite. And they did some videotapes of overweight people in Boston and found uniformly they ate too fast, ate much too fast. And they also ate according to the time of day. And they put them in a room and speeded up the clock. And when it was really 10:30 in the morning, the clock said 12 o'clock. And the people who were overweight all got out there on lunches and ate. But the people who were their right weight ate according to, they weren't hungry, so they didn't eat. So people have somehow gotten used to eating according to the time of day. Oh, it's 12 o'clock, time to eat. Not even thinking, is the body ready for food? Does it really need any food? What food does it need? No, it's lunchtime. So no matter what the body is saying in terms of feedback, it's time to eat. And getting free of that is part of the consciousness of yoga. So digestive tract comes down the center, esophagus sits like this. Basically a tube, and the stomach is like a bag of acid. The stomach is not even a very good cement mixer, and it has no teeth. So if you don't chew the food really well, it'll go straight down here. And the part of the process will be defeated of allowing that food to be bathed in acid to begin the breakup of the food. They had a nice television program a couple years ago called The Incredible Machine, about the human body, and they had a person in front of a fluoroscope, which is like an X-ray movie, eating a candy bar. And what he did was took the candy bar, 2 chews, and you saw the whole thing go straight down, landing like with a thud in the stomach. So that it's very important not to bypass the idea of chewing the food, to allow all the surfaces to be exposed to the full digestive process. Because even if we eat the right kinds of foods, if we don't digest them, they're not available. There's a valve right here, and what happens when one is anxious, there's oversecretion of acid, and the acid builds up to a certain point that it'll either, there's another valve here, splash up into the esophagus, and that's what gives you heartburn, is when the stomach becomes so full that this valve or junction area can't hold the contents of the stomach down there anymore, and the acid splashes up into the esophagus, and you get heartburn, which is a pain in the chest area of striking, burning pain. Or if it tends to then create too much acid here, it can usually then, too much acid, which is supposed to stay in the stomach, gets down into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, and causes ulcers. As the food passes through the digestive tract, there's about 26 feet of it, and it's really fascinating to see. So I brought along a little chart here for you to look at, comparing the length of the digestive tract and the length of a human person. So you see, if you eat cement, it has a long way to go. And anytime you take a grinder or a pizza or English muffin with white flour, that acts like glue in the system, and that's a long way for it to pass, and it causes irritation. Any kind of refined foods in this digestive tract. Meat is very low in fiber and causes irritation. So what I'll do is I'll just pass this around and you can look at it, take a look at the digestive organs. If you mix white flour and water, it makes a great paste. You can hang up wallpaper with it. But if you mix whole wheat flour and water, you can't hang up wallpaper with it because it won't stick. The fiber content of the whole wheat won't allow that kind of glue action or cement action. What happens when you constantly put white flour in the digestive tract like this is that then it kind of squeezes down to pass along the cement or the rocks if you eat meat. And this squeezing action, if you take clay in your hand and squeeze really hard, it'll come out through your fingers. And that's what happens to this digestive tract. And you get what's called diverticuli, or little outpouchings. So I'll draw you a few of these little outpouchings. This is his ascending colon, and then the transverse colon comes in descending colon here. And there's a valve called the ileocecal valve. There's a pouch here, the ileocecal valve, and the appendix right at this junction. So these diverticuli are little like bubbles along the colon like this. So many, yeah. About half of the people by the time of age 50 have significant numbers of these. And about 70% of the people in this country by the time they're 70 have significant numbers. If you just stand up for a minute, you can see, or just, that's fine, that the normal action of food going through this digestive tract is lost because it's going to go into one of these little outpouchings, and the normal muscles do not contract along this pouch here, and the food stays there for days or weeks or months. It putrefies, it causes problems, it causes gas, and that's one of the problems that old people in our country are faced with, is just bloating, indigestion, gas, feelings of uncomfort, and then further problems can occur. One of these can get inflamed and infected. You get diverticulitis. It can rupture the bowel contents into the abdomen, a surgical emergency. It can bleed. All these things are avoidable because you don't see this in countries that eat enough fiber and are vegetarian.
I know someone who has had it, and it's extremely painful. And I was wondering, once you do have it, what?
They used to treat it with cream of wheat and white flour and all the worst things. That's how they used to treat it, and people would continue to get more of these. So now they treat it with high fiber bran diets, and they seem to do well. It prevents you from getting more, and it keeps the things sort of slip sliding through so they don't get caught up in as much.
Are they reversible? I mean, will they go back in once you're done?
Once they're there, they're surgically, they're anatomically there. They won't put themselves back. But if you eat enough fiber, it'll prevent the problem from getting worse or things from getting stuck up in them as much. So colitis is another condition of irritation of the bowel. It can occur in the large or the small intestine, and it's almost not found at all in vegetarian populations, very rare. Cancer of the colon, again, this chronic irritation that comes from meat products and especially beef tends to be associated with cancer of the colon. Country by country, it's absolutely right on. The highest beef consumers are northern Scotland. They have the highest rate of cancer of the colon. Number 2 is Australia in beef consumption. Second highest, cancer of the colon. Number 3, United States. Cancer of the colon is the most common cancer among adults in the United States, next to skin cancer, which is not very important. It's curable in many instances, but it's a drag to lose part of your colon. Many people have to wear a bag on the side and so forth. It's avoidable because vegetarian populations don't get it, hardly at all, if they eat enough fiber and if they avoid meat. And particularly beef seems to be the one. Probably because the beef, when it's cooked, produces some really particularly toxic agents, charcoal broiled and so forth, that are quite irritating to the colon itself. And this constant chronic irritation causes cancer of the colon. And it's a preventable disease. When I was in India and traveling and speaking before a certain group, I was talking about cancer in the United States, and I said about 25% of Americans die of cancer. And they couldn't believe it. They had to make me repeat it 3 or 4 times. You mean 1 out of every 4 Americans dies of cancer? Because the statistics are so much lower for cancer in those countries. And it really is an epidemic. Certain cancers are getting more common in our country. Those associated with cigarettes are the most worrisome because the chances of surviving lung cancer are so little. At least this kind of cancer we can cure surgically. But again, it can be prevented. Even simpler diseases like appendicitis. In a vegetarian population in Kashmir, over a period of 20 years, they had 2 cases of appendicitis. And when the person who was doing this research brought this statistic up to one of the public health officials there and said, "Why don't you publish this? Why don't you let the world know that this is true?" He said, "We don't have enough cases." Because you have to have a number of cases to prove your point in medical circles. The most common operation in the United States among young people is appendix. And what happens is that these rocks that we eat, in the terms of meat and beef products, get stuck up in this little finger-like projection. And the appendix has a function. It's right at this junction between the small and large bowel. There's a blind pouch, a sort of pouch-like area where feces is stored before it takes the transit around the large intestine. And it's full of lymph tissue, the appendix, and it may secrete a hormone that speeds up or slows down the digestive process. Here you can see a picture of, lost myself here. You can see a picture of the appendix. And you can see some diverticuli in this picture here. And we can pass that around. This little finger-like projection is full of lymph tissue, and lymph is the defense mechanism against invaders or bacteria, or, particularly important, against abnormal cells. When there are abnormal cells in our body, the lymph picks them up and gobbles them up. So that the newer theories of cancer are that we all have cancer all the time. But our immune system, our lymph system, recognizes these cells as abnormal and gobbles them up. And they actually have pictures of this happening. So that the appendix has a great function. It's there at a place where there's likely to be abnormal change and a common place of cancer to occur in the bowel. And there's where lymph tissue is needed. So what we do is we see, well, it got inflamed, so we cut it out. The same thing we used to do with the tonsils until we discovered how important they were in our immune system.
What happens if you eat meat for say 16 years of your life or something, and then you're a vegetarian? What happens in those?
Well, some of the effects, which we'll talk about some more about the effects on the blood vessels and so forth, occur and can be reversed. Some of the effects, like a structural defect, would not be reversed, but at least it wouldn't get worse, and usually the complications could be prevented too. They've never done a study to see whether people who've lost their appendix have more cancer of the colon. I'm waiting for them to do that, and I bet it's going to show that they do. I'll pass this around.
We always learned in school that the appendix had no function.
That's because they didn't know. So anything with the sort of presumptive attitude of Western science, well, if we don't know about it, it's not there. It's not true. The same thing was true of tonsils for so many years. People had their tonsils removed. And then we discovered, yes, the tonsils are swollen because they're protecting you. They're providing lymph tissue. So it's a little presumptuous, shall we say, a little presumptuous to try to say that we could redesign the body better than that force which designed it. Now we're beginning to know. If you want to read on that idea, you ought to read Lives of a Cell by Lewis Thomas, which is written by a doctor who is now head of Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute, and was for many years a pathologist at Yale. And his writing is very clear and beautiful. Lives of a Cell by Lewis Thomas. Yeah, Lewis Thomas. Dr. Lewis Thomas. And one of his points is that he's looking to the time when we're beginning to have more and more say through biofeedback. We're beginning to know that we can control the body. And he's saying that he's a little scared about whether we're going to do a better job than that which is already going on, because it's so complex. The whole process is so complex that to take a part of it and say that, well, we can just look at this part, this tonsil, and we won't look at the whole picture. And we won't look at what's going to happen 20 years down the road. And yet, all these things are intertwined. It's to pick out one and to try to treat that separate from the whole. And that's why holistic medicine is so exciting for us. Because it says, okay, I'm going to not treat this thing as separate, but treat the whole being. Well, I want to go on with the digestive tract a little bit. And what happens to the food? It's been broken down. Let's see. Underneath the stomach and back behind it is the pancreas. And the pancreas has a duct which goes into the duodenum here. And it brings pancreatic juices, which are the lipases and proteases which break